everyone, Miss Carrie here from Miss Carrie's Creations. Today I am going to show you how to create 4 Memorial Day military cards using our Sunburst Thin Cut. The papers I'm going to be using today come from our Stars and Sparklers collection. You can see this is a beautiful red, white, and blue collection with a little bit of craft inside there. I'm also going to be using the Because of the Brave stamp and thin cut. This is also available in a Canadian stamp set called We Stand Guard for Thee. Along with these 2 items, I'm also going to be using our new Sunburst background thin cut die. I'm going to be using all of the paper patterns in this collection today, and I'm going to be cutting both the front and the back of these papers out using that thin cut die. I'm going to first cut one strip that measures about 4.5 inches wide. I'm going to place the die down onto all 3 pieces of paper, run it through my die cutting machine, and then I'm going to flip the papers over and run it through again. After you have run that die through your paper, start getting yourself organized. That is tip number 1 when you are using this Sunburst die. You can see I'm slowly pulling out each one of the pieces and I'm creating a nice, neat little pile for each of them, and then I'm going to set each of the frames aside. I've placed all of my pieces on my magnetic board here. My friend Jema used a muffin tin to organize her little pieces. Either way, you want to make sure that you have all of those little parts organized after you've cut them out of your paper and cardstock using that Sunburst die. I'm going to be creating 4 separate card backgrounds today. As you can see, I've already cut out some frames using some craft paper and sapphire cardstock to match that Stars and Sparklers paper. These cards are going to be both horizontal and vertical, and I'm going to be changing the location of that central circle on each card. Now I'm going to start creating the Sunburst design for each one of these card backgrounds. As I add each of the pieces, I do want to give you a few little tips and tricks when you're designing that Sunburst background. We already talked about organizing all of your little pieces. This is going to make it a lot easier to put these little puzzles together. When you are designing those different backgrounds using either papers or cardstock, think about your gallon, quart, pint ratio of colors. As you watch me put together these card backgrounds, you're going to notice that some of the card backgrounds have more blue, others have more red, and some might have more of that craft color. I don't want to overwhelm your eye, and that's why I like to stick to that gallon, quart, pint ratio when I'm choosing my colors. When you're trying to decide on a color combo, I do suggest you take a look at our Love of Color books. They have some wonderful color combinations in there, and they will give you all sorts of inspiration when you're designing your Sunburst cards. Another tip that I want to share with you as you create these backgrounds is to repeat your colors or patterns. If you take a look at the 2 cards on the right, you can see that I am doing a repetition of that craft color. Now I am alternating craft paper with the craft pattern paper just so that I have a little bit of interest in between the 2 designs, but it's still a repetition of color around that card. You also want to think in thirds or threes as you're creating the backgrounds for the cards. If you take a look at the lower left-hand card, you're going to see that I am adding some of those red stripes to the card around that pattern. Those red stripes are very bold and very bright, and they're going to stand out on that background. So I've only placed 3 of those stripes around the card, alternating it with 2 other blue patterns. I also used that red stripe on the upper left-hand card, but I was able to use more of that red stripe because I have a nice bold blue pattern in between each one of those red designs. All right, so now that we have all of our background designs created and you've learned a few little tips and tricks for designing backgrounds of your own, let me show you how I assembled these backgrounds. I've already adhered down one of the card bases using some liquid adhesive. On this card, I do want to show you how I added a little bit of distressing along the edges using some toffee ink. You're going to see that there's a little bit of a difference between leaving that paper as is and adding a little bit of toffee ink around the edges. It gives it a soft, aged, distressed look when you add that toffee ink. Once I had finished adding all of the ink around the edges of these pieces, I just used our multi-liquid glue to adhere down each one of those puzzle pieces inside the frame. Not only can you add ink to these card backgrounds, you can also use texture paste to give it a little bit of dimension. On these craft pieces, I took a polka dot stencil and our opaque texture paste to create some little polka dots across the craft paper. Not only does it give this card some texture, but it also adds a fun, whimsical pattern to that sunburst design on the card. On this last card, I did also add some toffee ink, but I only did it around the edges just to give that craft paper a little bit of color. Okay, so all 4 of our sunburst backgrounds have been created. Let's start decorating these cards using that Because of the Brave stamp set. On this first card, we're going to be creating a flag design using those 2 flag-shaped stamp sets. I'm going to be creating the stars using some sapphire ink. I'm just going to stamp the image here on some white daisy cardstock. The stripes for the flag are going to be stamped using scarlet ink. These 2 pieces are going to be cut out and layered atop each other, so I'm stamping them separately on the cardstock right now. Once the images have been stamped, I can go ahead and cut them out and start layering them on top of my card. I chose to fussy cut out each one of these images, but they are a rectangular shape, so you could use a paper trimmer if you wanted to. This flag shape is going to go over that circular design that is in the center of that sunburst pattern. I've chosen to use a rectangle instead of a circle shape for my focal point on this card. To bring in some more red and ground the image, I have grabbed 2 zip strips, one that is a craft polka dot and one that is a red plaid, and I'm going to be placing them on either side of that flag design. Since I covered up that central circle point with a rectangle, I still want to create some sort of circular frame to draw your eye to that flag. So I have cut out a little stitched circle using our Circle Shaker thin cuts. This is going to tuck right behind that flag. The hero sentiment is being stamped onto white daisy cardstock using espresso ink. After stamping the image, I'm going to use the matching thin cut die to cut out that sentiment. I did go ahead and add a little bit of toffee ink around the edges before I added it to the card. All of the elements on this card are placed down using liquid adhesive, thin 3D foam tape, and thick 3D foam tape. I chose to cut out those 2 flag images separately so that I could place some thin 3D foam tape behind the sapphire stars. If you don't want that many layers of dimension, you could stamp your stars directly onto that flag image. To embellish the card, I'm going to add a little gold star sequence on the flag and a wooden arrow over on the left side of the card. And now our first card is complete. I do suggest that if you are sending this to military personnel, you do not use the star sequence. Instead, use the little star stamp image that is included in the stamp set. Let's go ahead and move on to our second card. On this card, we're going to be using a masking technique to create that Home of the Brave image. I'm creating a mask using these full adhesive sticky notes. I put a link to these in the description below. I'm going to start by stamping an image onto one of the sticky notes. This image is going to be stamped out of sapphire and espresso ink. So I'm going to cut out the images that are being stamped in the espresso ink first. Now I'm going to assemble my mask onto a piece of white cardstock. I'm going to be stamping the espresso images first, so I've placed down the mask for the sapphire images down onto the cardstock. Now, the nice part about having clear acrylic blocks and stamps is that it's very easy to see where these images need to go on top of your mask. After you have stamped your first color, go ahead and place down those little puzzle pieces into your mask. You want to do this before you remove the larger portion of the mask. It makes it a lot easier to figure out where everything needs to go. Now I can remove that larger portion of the mask and stamp the remaining images in sapphire ink. Again, I'm able to see through that acrylic block right onto my mask and line up all my images. Take your time lining up these images so that you get a nice, crisp impression. Once we are done stamping that second color, we can go ahead and remove our mask and see the magic happen. Now we have a multicolored image we created with a simple masking technique. I've gone ahead and trimmed down this sentiment and created a piece of sapphire cardstock in the exact same size and shape as that sentiment. Now I'm just going to glue down these two images onto my card, tilting that sapphire piece of cardstock slightly behind the sentiment. I'm going to be adding 3 little flags off to the right of this sentiment using some of our zip strips. One is a polka dot, one is a red plaid, and the other has some red, white, and blue stripes on it. I've gone ahead and cut some chevrons into each one of these little flags, added some toffee ink on the edges, and then I'm just going to layer them over there on the right side of the Home of the Brave image. Now I'm going to add a little wooden star onto the card, and this second card is complete. I love how this one turned out. Let's go ahead and move on to our third card. For this card, I've cut a 2 3/4 inch circle out of craft, and I've already stamped the female officer in espresso ink and cut it out using that matching thin cut die. I'm going to be using a floral sticker from the Stars and Sparklers sticker sheet. I'm going to go ahead and remove some of the stickiness from the back using my anti-static pouch. I do want to add a little bit of distressing to this card, so I'm going to go ahead and add some toffee ink around that craft circle before I adhere it down onto the lower portion of the card. This circle has gone off the edge just a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and trim off that excess. Now I have a blue background and I have this blue sentiment, so I need to add another blue item to the card. So I went and cut myself a circle in a sapphire color, and I'm going to add a couple of little stamped images to that sapphire circle using some white daisy ink and one of the star images from that Because of the Brave stamp set. So this little sapphire circle not only matches the sentiment, but it's also going to help draw your eye to the central point of that card and to all of the images I'm going to be adding here in a minute. On this card, I created those texture paste polka dots, and I love the look of the polka dots on this card. So I decided to duplicate that image behind my sentiment using one of our little polka dot zip strips. I chose to use a female officer on this card, but as you saw, the stamp set also had a male officer you could use instead. Because I'm using the female officer, I decided to add that little floral image just to give this card a nice feminine touch. Behind that floral image, I'm going to tuck some loops of gold embellishing thread, and then I'm going to add some gold gems over there on the left side of the card, just to add a little bit of sparkle to this design. This card was so simple to put together. All right, let's go ahead and move on to our fourth and final card. To match the floral patterned paper, I'm going to be creating a flower using our 3D floral thin cut. The sentiment on this card is going to say thank you. You could use it as a general thank you card, or you could choose to send it to somebody who is in the service and add the for your service sentiment to the inside of the card. I'm going to go ahead and cut a little chevron shape into one side of the sentiment and then add a little bit of toffee ink around the edges. I'm just going to add a little bit of shaping to the petals on these flowers. I've cut them out of scarlet cardstock, and I'm just bending them slightly in the center. To match the toffee shading on the background and on the sentiment, I'm going to add some toffee shading to the petals of these flowers also. I've also added a stitched circle that's a little bit larger than the circle on the original card design. This larger circle shows up much better behind the flower. Now I'm just going to layer my flower images onto the card. I'm going to be using some 3D foam dots in between each of the layers. I'm not worried about the foam showing underneath the vellum because I'm going to be putting a star sequence in the center, and that is going to hide that foam dot. On one of the vellum layers, I chose to add a little bit of toffee ink. This gives it a soft, age-distressed look and matches the other elements of the card. After I added all of the flower layers, I decided to add a nice blue star sequence in the center of the flower. You could choose to leave this off if you wish, or you could add some bitty beads or a gem instead. I wanted to bring some more of the scarlet color onto this card, so I've grabbed another piece of that checkered zip strip and I'm going to tuck it behind that thank you sentiment. In my stash, I found some sapphire dots. These match this card perfectly and they create a nice visual triangle with that star sequence I placed in the center. While I had the dots out, I realized that they would also look great on two of the other cards I created. So I added a couple of them to the flag card and a few of them to that Home of the Brave card. These 4 Memorial Day military cards were very simple to make. I hope that this project inspired you to create these cards for Memorial Day, Veterans Day, or the 4th of July. I hope that it gave you a few new ideas for using that sunburst die and our Military Because of the Brave stamp set. I want to thank you for joining me today as we created these cards. Feel free to visit my card making playlist for more inspiration or visit my latest card making video tutorial. While you're at it, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so that you're notified when I add a new video to my channel. I hope you have a wonderful week. I can't wait to see what you create.